Mark Westfield loved the forest. For years, he had found solace among the towering pines, the whisper of leaves in the wind, and the soft crunch of dirt beneath his hiking boots. The pinewood forest, with its dense groves and winding, narrow trails, was his sanctuary, a vast, sprawling wilderness where he could clear his mind, surrounded by nature, miles away from the noise of his everyday life. Here, he was untouchable, removed from the stresses of the world, shielded by the wilderness. And he never went alone. His golden retriever, Max, was his steadfast companion on these outings. Max had been with him for 5 years, since he was a small, rambunctious puppy. In those early days, the little golden retriever would trip over his own feet as he tried to keep up with Mark. But as he grew, he developed a deep bond with his owner, and they became inseparable. Over time, Max had learned to navigate the trails as well as Mark, his senses sharpened by countless adventures. To Mark, Max was more than just a pet. He was family. Today was no different, or so he thought. The sun was just beginning to set as Mark prepared his pack. He tossed in a water bottle, some snacks, and Max's favorite worn-out tennis ball. The air outside was crisp, carrying the faint scent of decaying leaves and the earthy richness of autumn. As he opened the door, Max bounded out excitedly, his tail wagging so fast it was a blur. "All right, boy. Ready for an adventure?" Mark chuckled, patting the dog's head. Max responded with a joyful bark, his eyes shining with excitement. As they entered the forest, a familiar calm washed over Mark. He loved everything about this place. The earthy scent of pine and moss, the distant chirping of birds, the rustle of the underbrush as Max darted ahead. The forest always made him feel alive, grounded in a way no other place could. They walked for hours, winding through trails both familiar and newly discovered. The sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows that stretched across the ground like ghostly fingers. The forest took on a surreal, almost mystical quality as dusk settled. There was something about this time of day that always made Mark feel both at ease and slightly unsettled, as if the forest was hiding secrets that only the night could reveal. As they moved deeper into the forest, an unusual silence began to settle over the landscape. The cheerful bird songs faded, and even the rustling of small animals in the underbrush ceased. The quiet was thick, almost oppressive, pressing in on Mark, making him feel strangely alert. Max seemed to sense it too. His ears perked up, and he stayed closer to Mark, his eyes darting around, searching for something unseen. "Guess it's just us tonight, boy," Mark whispered, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. He patted Max's head, feeling the familiar warmth and softness of his fur. But even his voice seemed swallowed by the silence, muffled as if the forest itself was absorbing every sound. They continued on, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was irrational, he told himself. He'd been in these woods countless times, and he knew every path and turn by heart. But tonight felt different. The air was thicker, heavier, and every shadow seemed to stretch just a little too long, to linger just a little too darkly. Max noticed it too. Every so often, he would stop, his body going rigid, his gaze fixed on something deep in the trees. Then he would look back at Mark, his eyes wide, as if seeking reassurance. "You all right, Max?" Mark asked softly, crouching down beside him. But Max didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the shadowed trees ahead. And that's when it happened. Mark decided to take a trail he hadn't explored in years, one that wound even deeper into the forest than most of the well-worn paths. It was a riskier route, overgrown with foliage and littered with rocks and twisted roots. But he knew Max loved exploring unfamiliar places, and tonight, despite the eerie atmosphere, Mark felt the pull of adventure. The further they walked, the darker the woods became. The thick canopy above blocked out the remaining daylight, casting the forest floor in an eerie, dim light. Shadows stretched long and dark between the trees, giving the impression of hidden figures lurking just beyond sight. Mark's senses sharpened, each crackle of a twig, each whisper of wind against the leaves heightening his awareness. They reached a small clearing, bathed in the last rays of the setting sun, and for a brief moment, Mark felt a sense of relief. But the relief was fleeting. As they paused to rest, Max suddenly stiffened, his ears flat against his head, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the trees. Mark followed his gaze, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "Max? What is it, boy?" he whispered, his voice barely audible against the silence. Max didn't respond. His body remained tense, his eyes unblinking as he stared into the shadows. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to shake off the unease, but the feeling lingered, settling in the pit of his stomach like a stone. And then, without warning, Max bolted. "Max!" Mark's voice broke through the silence, echoing into the void of trees. But the dog didn't stop. He dashed forward, slipping between trees and underbrush, his movements frantic, driven by a purpose Mark couldn't understand. Mark sprinted after him, heart pounding, but a strange heaviness weighed down his legs, as if the forest itself were resisting his movements. He stumbled, vision blurring as he tried to keep up with Max. The trees seemed to close in around him, twisting and shifting, forming a labyrinth that stretched away into darkness. "Max!" he shouted again, desperation lacing his voice, but his own words sounded distant, muffled, as if swallowed by the dense, impenetrable silence. He kept running, his breaths coming quick and shallow, his heart hammering in his chest. But the forest had grown darker, and the shadows seemed to move, twisting and writhing as if they were alive. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, but every shadow seemed to stretch, taking on grotesque, almost human shapes that lurked between the trees, watching him. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something, a figure, tall and gaunt, lurking just beyond the tree line, its form distorted and unnatural. He could feel its gaze on him, cold and calculating, and his skin prickled with fear. Panic surged through him, and he turned back, stumbling over rocks and roots as he tried to retrace his steps. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, his thoughts racing as he struggled to make sense of what he'd seen. All he knew was that he needed to get home, that he couldn't stay here in the darkened forest with those eyes watching him. By the time he stumbled out of the forest and onto the familiar dirt road that led to his home, the sun had long since set, and darkness cloaked the world in shadow. Mark fumbled with his keys, finally getting the door open, and stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind him. He leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath, his mind racing with worry and fear. Max was still out there, somewhere, alone in the dark, and Mark couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure, lurking in the trees, watching him with eyes that seemed to pierce through the night. He spent the next few hours pacing, his anxiety growing with each passing minute. He tried to reassure himself, telling himself that Max was smart, that he knew the forest better than most people. But the way Max had run, it wasn't like him. It was as if something had called to him, something deeper in the forest. The silence of the house felt oppressive, each tick of the clock loud in the empty room. Mark glanced at the window, half expecting to see something lurking outside, but the yard was empty, bathed in the cold, pale light of the moon. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was waiting, just beyond the edge of his vision. A soft scratching at the door jolted him from his thoughts, and Mark's heart leapt. He rushed to the door, flinging it open, half expecting to see Max standing there, his tail wagging as if nothing had happened. And there, on the doorstep, was Max. Mark's initial relief at seeing Max was overwhelming, nearly bringing him to tears. He crouched down, his hands reaching out to pull his beloved dog into an embrace, but something in him hesitated. Max was standing unnaturally still, his head tilted at a slight, awkward angle, staring at Mark with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. Those eyes, they were the same warm brown, but there was something unsettling, something colder and sharper, lurking beneath the surface. "Max?" Mark whispered, his hand hovering just above his dog's head, unsure if he should touch him. Max's eyes didn't blink, didn't waver. The familiar glint of warmth and excitement was gone, replaced by a look that was too focused, too calculating. Mark hesitated, then let out a shaky laugh, trying to brush off his fears. "Guess we both had a rough night, huh, buddy?" he muttered. attempting to sound cheerful. He reached out to pat Max's head, and that's when he noticed it. Max's fur didn't feel quite right. Normally, it was soft and warm, but now it felt almost coarse, rougher, with an odd, metallic scent that made Mark wrinkle his nose. He dismissed it as his mind playing tricks on him after hours of worry. "Come on, Max," he said, standing up and gesturing for the dog to follow him inside. Max moved, but his movements were slow, jerky, almost mechanical, as if he were imitating the natural gait of a dog without truly understanding it. Inside the house, Mark watched Max from the corner of his eye, unease growing with each passing moment. Max didn't settle into his usual spot by the couch, where he'd always curled up after a long hike. Instead, he paced back and forth across the living room, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor in a steady, unnerving rhythm. Every so often, he would stop, his head snapping toward Mark with that same eerie focus, as if he were studying him. It was during one of these long, unnerving stares that Mark noticed something else. Max's face. It seemed wrong, slightly stretched and misshapen, almost as if the skin were too tight around his bones. His eyes were darker, more hollow, and his mouth didn't rest naturally. Instead, his lips pulled back slightly, baring his teeth in a strange, unnatural way. Mark's heart pounded, his chest tight with fear. He tried to ignore the dread building inside him, convincing himself he was just tired, that the night had played tricks on his mind. He forced a smile, clapping his hands to get Max's attention. "Hey, boy, let's get you some water," he said, his voice shaky. Max stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment before finally turning to follow him into the kitchen. As Mark filled Max's bowl, he glanced at the dog, expecting him to drink eagerly after a long night in the forest. But Max didn't touch the water. He simply stared at it, his head tilting in that strange, unsettling way, as if he were studying the concept of drinking without truly understanding it. A shiver ran down Mark's spine. He backed away, watching Max with a wary gaze. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to fully accept it. This was his dog, his loyal companion, wasn't it? Mark's mind drifted to the stories his grandfather used to tell him. Back when he was just a boy, they'd sit by the campfire, the flames casting long shadows on the trees as his grandfather's voice wove tales of the forest. Tales of creatures that could mimic the forms of animals, creatures that could lure unsuspecting travelers to their doom. Skinwalkers, his grandfather had called them. "They're not real," Mark had protested, but his grandfather only shook his head. "There are things in this world, Mark, things we don't understand," he'd said, his voice solemn. "The forest is full of mysteries, and some of them are best left undisturbed." Now, standing in his kitchen, staring at the dog that looked like Max but somehow wasn't, Mark felt the weight of his grandfather's words more deeply than he ever had before. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thought. Skinwalkers were just stories, just legends meant to scare children. But as he watched Max tilt his head, his unblinking eyes fixed on him, Mark couldn't help but wonder if there was more truth to those tales than he'd once believed. The night wore on, and Mark couldn't bring himself to sleep. He sat in the living room, watching as Max paced back and forth, his movements growing more erratic. Occasionally, he would stop and stare at Mark, his mouth twitching in that disturbing, too-wide grimace. Mark's anxiety grew, his mind racing with every possible explanation. Maybe Max was sick. Maybe he'd eaten something toxic in the forest, something that was affecting his behavior. He tried to call the vet, but it was past midnight, and the phone rang endlessly with no answer. As the clock struck 2, Mark found himself drifting into a fitful doze, his mind clouded with fear and exhaustion. But he was jolted awake by a sound, a low, rumbling growl that sent a chill down his spine. Mark's eyes snapped open, and he found himself staring into the face of the creature that wore Max's form. The dog was standing just inches from him, its lips pulled back in a grotesque parody of a smile, baring teeth that seemed sharper, more elongated than they should be. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he looked into its eyes, which were no longer the warm brown he recognized. They were black, hollow, devoid of anything remotely canine. "You're..." "You're not Max," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. The creature's mouth twisted, stretching wider, as if it understood him. A low, guttural growl rumbled from its chest, and it took a slow, deliberate step forward. Mark scrambled back, his mind racing, his hands searching for anything he could use to defend himself. His fingers closed around a heavy book, and he hurled it at the creature, watching as it bounced off its head, barely phasing it. The creature let out a hissing, almost mocking sound, its gaze fixed on Mark with a hunger that chilled him to his core. It moved closer, its body contorting, the illusion of fur and skin beginning to peel away, revealing something dark, twisted, and utterly inhuman beneath. Mark's vision blurred with terror. He stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table as the creature advanced, its steps slow and deliberate, savoring his fear. He managed to get to his feet, heart pounding, and backed away, never taking his eyes off the thing that had once been his loyal companion. Mark's instincts kicked in. He bolted toward the door, fumbling with the lock, his hands shaking as he tried to pull it open. Behind him, he heard the creature's footsteps, slow and steady, closing in on him. He finally managed to throw the door open and dashed outside, not daring to look back. He ran, his lungs burning, his mind racing, every instinct screaming at him to keep going. He could feel the creature's gaze on him, its presence a dark, looming weight that seemed to cling to him as he sprinted down the dirt road that led away from his home. The forest loomed around him, silent and still, as if it, too, was watching him, holding its breath as he fled. The shadows seemed to twist and shift, forming shapes that reached out to him, and the trees whispered with voices that weren't his own. Mark stumbled, his foot catching on a root, and he fell to the ground, his hands scraping against the dirt. He looked back, and there, standing at the edge of the trees, was the creature. It had taken on a distorted version of Max's form again, but its eyes gleamed with an intelligence that was anything but animal. "Stay away," Mark shouted, his voice cracking, but the creature didn't move. It simply stood there, watching him with that unsettling, unblinking stare. Mark scrambled to his feet and continued running, pushing himself to the limits of his endurance. His mind was a whirlwind of terror and confusion, his only thought to get as far away as possible, to escape the nightmare that had taken his dog's form. By the time the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Mark had reached the edge of town. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, his mind reeling with the events of the night. He looked back at the forest, half expecting to see the creature emerging from the shadows, but there was nothing, only the silent, empty woods, bathed in the soft light of morning. But he knew, deep down, that the creature was still out there, lurking in the trees, waiting for its next chance to strike. And every so often, when he looked into the darkened woods, he would see a pair of gleaming eyes staring back at him, a reminder of the horror that awaited anyone who dared to venture too deep into the forest. Mark's life was never the same after that night. The forest he once loved had become a place of nightmares, a haunting memory of the creature that had worn his dog's face, that had looked at him with hunger and malice. And every time he closed his eyes, he could still see those hollow, black eyes, waiting, watching. He would never trust the forest or the familiar face of a beloved companion again.